Welcome to Module 3 covering labels and other forms of warning in MIOSHA's Hazard Communication Standard. In any workplace that handles hazardous chemicals, clear and effective communication is essential for ensuring the safety of all employees. Hazard communication labeling provides critical information about the contents of containers, the risks they pose, and how to properly handle them. This labeling system, standardized under the Hazard Communication Standard, helps workers quickly identify potential dangers and take appropriate precautions. Containers which are sent from the manufacturer or distributor to another facility are considered shipped containers. The standard requires shipped containers to have specific information on the label, which is affixed to the chemical container. The label is intended to provide valuable information to the user on the hazards, proper precautions, and emergency procedures. These labels are not the same as Department of Transportation labels. Shipped containers are required to have the following 6 elements: the product identifier, the signal word, the hazard statements, pictograms, precautionary statements, and the name of the responsible party and the US based address and telephone number. The responsible party is someone who can provide additional information on the chemical and appropriate emergency procedures if necessary. One of 2 signal words may appear on the shipped container label. These words are either danger, which indicates a more severe hazard, or warning, which indicates a less severe hazard. Which signal word appears is based on the hazard classification and hazard category determined by the manufacturer and associated specific guidelines described in Appendix C of the standard. These signal words provide a general idea of the potential severity associated with the chemical's hazards. The hazard statements on the label provide a description of the hazards based on the manufacturer's classification of the chemical. These hazard statements are uniform for each specific classification and category. For example, a chemical classified as a Category 1 flammable liquid must contain the statement, extremely flammable liquid and vapor. Hazard statements for each hazard identified by the manufacturer must be present on the label. Precautionary statements are phrases used to describe recommended measures to minimize or prevent adverse effects from exposure or improper storage and handling. These statements relate to preventing exposure, the response if exposed, storage, and the disposal of a chemical. For example, these statements may include: do not breathe dust or fumes, if inhaled, remove person to fresh air, store in a well-ventilated place, dispose of contents in accordance with local regulations. Each facility's use, process, and exposure to a chemical may vary, and all precautionary statements may not be applicable in every situation. Pictograms are graphics which are intended to convey information relating to the hazards of the chemical. There are 9 pictograms which may appear on the label. This table shows each pictogram with the applicable hazards it may represent: the circle with flames above it, the flames, the exploding bomb, the test tube pouring on metal and hands, the cylinder, the skull and crossbones, the exclamation point, the chest with star emblem known as the health hazard, and the environmental. As you can see, one pictogram may represent multiple hazards. For example, the test tube pouring on hands and metal may represent the chemical is corrosive to metal, corrosive to skin, or corrosive to the eyes, or potentially a combination of any of the 3. It is important to reference the safety data sheet and other label elements to determine the specific hazards of the chemical. When chemicals are sent from a manufacturer or distributor, it may be necessary to label the outside packaging or containers with the Department of Transportation pictograms. The transportation pictograms may appear with the GHS pictograms, or in some cases, instead of the GHS pictograms, so it is important to be aware of what these symbols represent as well. As a review, the 6 required elements for a container that is shipped from the manufacturer or distributor are the product identifier, signal word, hazard statements, pictograms, precautionary statements, and the name and US address and telephone number of the responsible party. The sample label to the right provides an example of how these labels may look on a container in your workplace. The supplemental information section is not a requirement. However, a manufacturer may include this section to provide additional useful information. It is important to ensure incoming chemicals are labeled properly and that chemicals already on site do not have damaged or unreadable labels. Below is an example of a shipped label. Take a few moments to see if you can identify all the elements of the label. The labeling requirements for small containers that are less than 100 milliliters and less than 3 milliliters that come from a manufacturer or distributor may differ from those for large containers. These requirements apply to small containers where the manufacturer determines that pull-out or fold-out labels are not feasible. For containers with a capacity of less than 100 milliliters, the label must identify the product identifier, pictograms, signal word, chemical manufacturer, and phone number, and a statement that the full label is provided on the immediate outer package. The photo in the top right shows one example of this size container. Another frame of reference is your travel size toiletries are roughly 100 milliliters. For containers with a capacity of less than 3 milliliters, where any label is infeasible, at minimum the product identifier must be on the container. The smaller eyedrop size container is an example of a product this size. The outer package which holds the small containers must contain all the required label elements of a shipped container and a statement that all small containers must be stored in the outer packaging when not in use. As with all labels, the outer packaging label must not be removed or damaged. When labeling containers which hold chemicals dispensed from a shipped or bulk container, there are two compliant options. The first option is to affix a label which contains all the same required elements as the shipped container label. The second option is to ensure that each secondary container is labeled with the product identifier and any combination of words, pictures, or symbols which provides general information regarding the hazards of the chemical. These may include options such as signal words, pictograms, hazard statements, or others. Specific information on the hazards must also be readily available to employees, such as safety data sheets or other means. Where stationary containers act as a secondary container, there is additional flexibility to use signs, placards, or written materials to fulfill this labeling requirement. Regardless of the labeling system in place, employees must be trained over the site-specific methods, the information conveyed on the label, and how to get specific information on the hazards if needed. Good secondary container labeling is crucial for safety, compliance, and proper chemical handling. Some things that make secondary labeling effective include clear identification of the chemical, including appropriate and recognizable hazard warnings, and legibility and durability, such as using water-resistant or chemical-resistant labels that will not wear off. Below represents two secondary container label options for the same product. On the left is an example of a label which contains all 6 required elements that would appear on the shipped container label. On the right is an example of a label which contains the product identifier, pictograms, signal word, and hazard statements, along with the composition of the chemical. While both of these are viable options, employers must be sure to train employees on where specific information on the hazards, precautions, and supplier information can be located if not included within the label. Employees must be trained to understand the labeling methods and meanings for chemicals in their work area. Labels on shipped and secondary containers must not be removed, defaced, or illegible. Labels must be in English at minimum, however, additional languages are allowed on the containers. One exemption to secondary container labeling applies only to containers which are used to transfer chemicals from a shipped container immediately to another process or labeled container. This exemption only applies if the transfer is immediate and does not leave control of the employee transferring the chemical. Additionally, for solid materials like steel beams, solid wood, metal castings, a label must be provided with the initial shipment, but does not need to be resent unless there are changes to the label. The Global Harmonized System, adopted by the Hazard Communication Standard, is a system we have discussed in the training so far. However, other labeling and classification systems may be present in your work area. One of these is the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA 704, whose diamond may look familiar. While both these systems are designed to help communicate information about the hazards of a chemical, they differ in their approach. The GHS system is intended to inform workers about hazards of chemicals under normal circumstances or foreseeable emergencies. In contrast, the NFPA system is designed to inform emergency personnel of basic hazard information during a response. The GHS system uses categories generally between 1 and 4, with 1 indicating the most severe hazard. The NFPA system works opposite, categorizing hazards between 0 and 4, with 4 being the most severe. The categorization numbers are not interchangeable between these two systems. Finally, the GHS system includes information about both the acute and chronic hazards of a chemical. The NFPA labels are designed to include acute hazard information, but do not include chronic hazards. It is important to be aware of any alternative labeling systems in the facility and make sure you understand the meaning. For questions, consult the person responsible for your hazard communication program. Can you identify what's wrong with the labels below? The two containers in the left and middle photos are workplace secondary containers, and the blue drum on the right is a container which was received from a manufacturer. We'll pause for about 5 seconds to let you identify any issues. The bottle on the left-hand side contains the product identifier, but does not contain any information about the hazards of the chemical. The bottle in the middle at one time appears to have had a compliant label, however the information is no longer readable, so the information is not available now. The drum on the far right is a shipped container, and it is missing the compliant label with the 6 required elements. On the right are 2 containers that were found unattended in a workplace, and other workers in the room were not sure what was in either bottle. The spray bottle was found to be a diluted glass cleaner. The drink bottle next to it actually held the concentrated form of the glass cleaner and was being used because the original container was leaking. The SDS for the glass cleaner concentrate showed that it was a Category 3 flammable liquid, Category 2A serious eye irritant, and that it may cause intestinal irritation if it was ingested. By storing a chemical improperly, a serious accident may have occurred if someone were to drink from the bottle, a splash happened, or even if it was stored too close to a heat source. Examples of this have occurred and resulted in hospitalizations in multiple cases where unsuspecting employees drank from water bottles filled with corrosive cleaners. A second example of why proper containers and labels are important also was reported to OSHA because of a hospitalization. In this situation, an employee was mixing a batch of marine mold cleaner. The employee added the wrong chemical to the mixture, causing a chemical reaction creating chlorine gas. The employee inhaled the chlorine gas and was hospitalized. The inspection revealed that it was unlabeled secondary containers that played a role in the accidental mixing. Proper containers and labeling ensure that chemicals are identifiable, and in connection with training, the critical information is available so employees can work safely. This concludes Module 3. Module 4 will discuss safety data sheets in the workplace.